Had enough of the been there, done that ideas? Tired of too much talk and so little action? Rewind now and welcome to Transformation and Change Radio with Dr. Kathy Obear, where the vision of true equity, inclusion, courage, and purpose meet powerfully. Dr. Kathy delivers with dynamic, engaging conversation and the most authentically brave dialogue on air today. This hit show will challenge you to explore current issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion and deepen your capacity to choose courage to speak up to greater inclusion in everything you do. Fasten your seatbelts and accelerate your effectiveness to become a powerful change agent in your life, community, job, and society. Imagine true equity and inclusion and get the tools to really manifest your vision. No frills, no fluff, just really powerful, good stuff. Transformation and Change Radio starts now.
Welcome to Transformation and Change Radio. I'm Dr. Kathy Obear with my co-host and dear friend, Dr. Becky Martinez. We are so excited. Dr. Robin DiAngelo is here with us today, and you all may know her from her work at University of Washington, where she's an affiliate associate professor, but my guess is you know her work from White Fragility. It was early, like 2011, I think you coined the term, and then your book was published in 2018, and it just has rippled in the anti-racism, particularly with white folk, just to really help us realize the ways that we defend and we try to resist. And I'm even more excited because some people might know you from Nice Racism, a book that came out a year or so ago, and hot off the presses, the Facilitator's Guides for White Affinity Groups. I could have pulled out the other two because they're right here on my...
Well, I have them prominently displayed.
Well, there you go. But your work for years, over 20 years of consulting, training, speaking, teaching, your work really has focused so much of helping particularly white folks understand the dynamics of race, racism, what's in it for us to dismantle, and really calling us to partner with folk of color, Indigenous folk. What we're excited about today, as I call you colleague, I've learned from you, and friend, is we're excited to have you here talking about dynamics of class and classism, because I think we're going to find all kinds of learning and connections, and particularly from your own life experience growing up. And so we just want to welcome you to Transformation and Change Radio.
Well, thank you so much. I'm just thrilled to be with you.
Yes, thank you. I'm excited to be in this conversation, especially as we pull the thread around class. You know, I think I started my work around race, being a mixed race person, and then I went to an institute, the Social Justice Institute, and I was like, oh shit, I've got so much there around class, especially as somebody who grew up working class, sometimes working poor, who straddles class. And that's how I identify myself, as a class straddler. And that's where I've done some great work in academia, particularly to talk about class. And so thank you for joining us. And we're going to start out with the question that we always start out with is, what's your class story? Give us a little bit about your class journey.
Well, I was born in the late 50s to working class parents. My father was a sheet metal worker. My mother was like a receptionist at the time. I don't know if the younger listeners understand a switchboard operator, but if you ever seen an old movie where the person's plugging in the different telephones, when she could hold a job, she did that. My parents were divorced when I was about 2. And we went to live with my mother. From that point until her death, I rarely ever saw my father. So I was raised by my mother, and she was now a single mom in the 50s with 3 children, 3 little girls. And I know it's a concept that's not similar today, this idea of childcare, because childcare is normal today, but back in the 50s, if you were in childcare, you were definitely poor. It was an integrated space racially for me as a child, because poverty, is so racialized in this country. And we had periods of homelessness. We had periods where we lived in our car. My mother had leukemia. So not only was she a single mother, but the last 5 years of her life, she was struggling with leukemia, and she was a veteran. So she got her health care through the Veterans Administration, which was not good health care. And so she definitely couldn't keep a job during those years. And she was hospitalized for different periods, and we'd be sent to live with different relatives or our grandparents. She had trouble keeping us clean and taking care of us. This is relevant to my class story.
Yeah.
Because, we were dirty. I never saw a dentist until my mother died. She died at age 37 when I was 11 years old, and I was the youngest of the three. So we were 11, 12, and 13. My teeth were visibly rotten. My front teeth are filled because they had big holes in them. I was a bedwetter. We understand that now as often a psychological or, a response to trauma. But back then it was just a deep frustration for all the adults around me. But I mention that too because maybe we bathed once a week. I'm quite sure that I did not smell good. I actually once had a teacher hold my hand up in class. Literally, she came over to my desk, she pulled my hand up, she showed the class as an example of poor hygiene. And then told me to go home and tell my mother to wash me. But I think the real moment that I'll never forget was my mom took us over to see some friends of hers, some lady she knew. You know how when you're a kid, you just go with the parents. And if they have kids at that house too, then you play with the kids while the adults talk. And as we were leaving, I was the last one out the door, and I overheard one of the children say to her mother, "What's wrong with them?" Like that was the question she asked. And I stopped, I wanted to hear the answer. And her mother went like this, "Shh, they're poor." I'll never forget it. It was one of those moments where you realize that there's something shameful about you, something that everyone can see, but that shouldn't be named. So I had such a deep sense of shame as a child. That is going to tie to my racial story, and I don't know if you want me to weave that in now or to wait. But when my mother did die, we were sent to live with my father. He was blue collar, but he made good money as a construction worker. So we were very straight up working class. We were not poor, but the culture was deeply working class. And just one other thread would be sexism, because my dad was he sexist? But just an example of how working class he was. He had this, the den, that was his room. And he had a subscription to Playboy magazine. And every month when Playboy came, he would take the staples out of the centerfold, frame the centerfold, and line the walls of his study. He had 3 teenage girls. I'm also a very angry feminist and proud of it. But it's just, for me, such a great example of how blue collar the culture was. And maybe the last piece was, nobody went to college. Was never a conversation. There was never what do you want to be when you grow up and how will you get there? It was always just like, in my mind, when you're 18, you're on your own and you just go survive and figure it out. So I didn't go to college until I was a 30-year-old single mom myself. I graduated my undergrad at age 34. And I am now upper middle class based on the success just recently of my work, but the vast majority of my life has been definitely working class.
I was catching myself taking a couple of deep breaths as you were sharing. And so the first thing I just want to say is thank you. Those pieces of us can be really difficult to talk about. And so appreciate the storytelling. And I do want to get how it intertwines with, race and racism. I think the question before that is how have some of those messages that you learned show up or around class, right? So how has your class story impacted how you show up in a class space?
Oh, powerfully. You can't, unlike race, you're not going to look at me and know my class story. And you're going to see me in arenas in which I wouldn't be in if I had the class background typically that I have, right? So you're going to see me in middle or upper class environments. You're going to see me in a college classroom, in a faculty meeting, this type of thing. But the day late, dollar short is so strong for me. I sincerely did not know I was smart. I do have some grief about where would I be if from an early age my mind had been nurtured, if I had been encouraged. I can't imagine, right? For me, high school was where you went to escape home. And I was out in the field getting high. So there's that loss that comes up for me, and I look at those other people who were groomed to be there. I definitely struggle with that imposter syndrome. It keeps me silent, and this is also going to connect when we start talking about race. Even though I know what I know in my area, I'm just sure they've read research I haven't read, or they understood the data better than I did because I'm not good in math. It just plays out in those are just a few ways.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, it's so powerful, right? Particularly because, as you say, people perceive you in a certain way currently.
Yes.
And don't know anything that's below the surface and have assumptions. And that is often how class plays itself out, right? It is your class of origin, it's your current class, and it's your perceived class, and what all of that means, and how we're socialized around class. So I appreciate the share. Kathy, did you want to come in? And
always, but I learned so much more about Robin from you, even though I've spent time with you. And so thank you for your vulnerability. And I'm struck at least with two things as grown up middle class, white collar professional class. I too was out in the field smoking pot, but the teachers either overlooked it or didn't know because I was assumed to be smart. Not only because of my class background, I had two older sisters, one that particularly did well. And so they're just all those assumptions. The other thing that really struck me about the den was how many middle and upper middle and rich families had so much room, metaphorically, so that they could hide all kinds of sexualizing, sexual assault, racist attitudes. And yet I wonder how much space has to do with why we have this belief that folks in working class and poor have more bigotry than folks who are middle, upper middle, and because we can hide it. You don't see it. We're literally behind locked gates, metaphorically. And so it just really struck me because I grew up, I heard all those assumptions about folks that were poor and working class, and I still see that, particularly around white working class and white poor today. Just they're racist, they're classist, they're sexist, they're homophobic. And I wonder how much we in our class privilege project onto folks. This is a new thought. But we have it. We just are saying that folks who are fewer resourced are really the problem. So those are the two quick thoughts that came up for me as I was hearing you.
Yeah, and connected to that kind of what it looks like from the outside, it connects to the culture of class, right? So I have this idea in mind, this kind of image in my mind that poor people, like all your junk is in the yard. Okay. The car's up on jacks. Everything's a mess. Maybe dad's stumbling out there drunk or whatever, but everybody can see it. In generally, I think working class cultures are much more open and much more transparent about showing their stuff. But the middle class yard has got the nice picket fence, and inside dad's a raging drunk. Inside, perhaps sexual assault is taking place, but the veneer on the outside looks very neat and clean.
And how do we perpetuate? I'm sorry, you go.
No, go ahead. No, you go ahead, and then I'll go.
Well, if I think of all the TV and movies I watched that perpetuated that image and stereotypes, and we all know it's not true. Yes, there are portions, and I think more poor working class culture is more of a authentic, I'm just going to be who I am, instead of this individual veneer that I was taught, like hide everything. And And yet these stereotypes persist of middle class is better than the working class. So that's the only thing I was going to say is it's just perpetuated these stereotypes.
Yeah.
Well, and then I think you can add the layer around race, right? And depending on the race culture and the class culture, right? And so I know folks that as growing up working class and folks of color, like you wanted to make sure that all of your stuff was as neat as possible. You didn't have a lot of stuff. You maybe had a couple of cars in the driveway or on the street. But one, you didn't have a lot of things, right? And two, you wanted to make sure that everything looked as good as it could look, right? And you coveted the possessions that you had because it's like, I don't know when I'm going to get that again. And so, there's and because your communities of color and can already be targeted, right, you want to make sure that you can be perceived as clean as possible.
Yes. Now that theme of clean, if I may pick it up, was also where I understood that I was white. So I knew that I was poor. I knew that it was shameful. I knew that I was dirty, all of that. And I also, on some level, always knew that I was white, that it was better to be white, that we were on the bottom, but I visualized we were standing on the floor, but people of color were under the floor, right? And the most powerful example of how I got that message is how I was warned to never touch anything a colored person could have touched, which was the language of the time, which meant Black people. Because if I touched it, I would be dirty. Right? Don't sit there. You don't know who to sat there. Could have been a colored person. I maybe would be in a park and I would see food left on a table and I would reach for it and I would be admonished, don't touch it. You don't know who touched it. And, again, it was clear. If it had been touched by a Black person, it'd be dirty. And the irony was we were dirty. And I mean that literally, right? But in those moments, I wasn't poor anymore. I wasn't shameful anymore. In those moments, I was white and I was realigned with the dominant culture that my poverty separated me from. And while I think the big picture, white people use Black people to project our sins onto, we clearly projected our dirt onto Black people. We used them, we needed them. And so it's that simultaneous, you are less than, but you are more than. Yeah.
I'm struck that you were so hungry, you were going to eat a leftover sandwich. And whatever adult it was willing for you to literally starve rather than build partnerships or coalitions across race.
It reminds me of the title of Jonathan Metzl's book, Dying of Whiteness.
Yeah.
Willing to, in order to preserve that bargain of a little more status, if you let yourself be exploited, right? We'd have universal health care if we weren't able to stimulate racial animus in the working class,
Yeah. Oof. I know. You want to go, Kath? You want me to go?
You go. I was just chatting.
Okay. So given your work, and I know we're going to take a break in a few minutes. What are the ways that you notice class shows up?
So in my work, we talk a lot about privilege and power and advantage and structural inequality. So I see it in a few ways. I see it one in the way that middle and upper class people minimize their positions. And so, I mean, I've never met a middle class person or upper class person who wasn't the poorest of the rich kids, right? So they're always gonna like when they make that point, I mean, when they're hanging around the rich kids, I don't think they make that point. But when they need the cultural capital of a little more victimization, there's always this qualifier. Well, we weren't the richest family in the neighborhood, So I see it there. I recently read, somebody asked me to provide a blurb for a book on owning class white men. And the writer identified himself in that way, but also said, I was the first in my family to go to a private university. And I'll be honest, I just rolled my eyes like, okay, come on. Like, that's like, wow, it was I mean, and I get that it's a different culture probably than a public university, but that did not, for me, credential him as, less privileged. So I see that. I also see all of the memes about Karen, all of the white women this, white women that, which I'm just going to say, I think there's a thread of misogyny that makes it so easy to express contempt for white women. Have we shown up in any collective way? No. But when anybody does show up who's white, it will be overwhelmingly women. But I also read a study that said of all of the kind of class categories of white people, white working class women were the most consistent in terms of allyship. So this kind of Karen who's perfect and calls the manager, that's a middle class white woman, right? We act like that's a universal white woman.
Yes,
I'm sorry, and I'm not trying to get out from under all of my racism and the way that it manifests, but it does manifest somewhat differently because of my class background. And so this assumption about white women, I always think to myself, the passive aggressive, the conflict avoidant, that is a class. Those are class characteristics, and they don't typically apply the same for working class women. Does that make sense to you?
Complete sense, right? And I see that showing up all of the time of, even in academia, right? Class of origin has you be like direct, like, let's just get to the point. And if there are white women who grew up in that class of origin, that's how I see it playing out. And that's not the norm, and that's not always advantageous for them. But for white women who grew up in this middle class plus class of origin, know how to be strategic and intentional, and like all of the ways in which it shows up. And so I see that all the time.
Yeah. Maybe the last thing is, I mean, I said I was an angry feminist, so I am clear as a bell that patriarchy, misogyny, and sexism are deep. But okay, I lost my thought there for a second. So, yeah, I'll just let that go.
I'm glad I'm not the only one that loses thoughts.
That's why I take notes.
I did want to own that when you were speaking, I knew insight, because I say middle class, professional, white collar, but when I'm in any chance I have, I'll say, but my mom made our clothes. And so I also want to be down with, and for me, I think comes out of shame of having so much more than what 95% of the world, 60-80% of the US. That's a different kind of shame. It's a shame of privilege as opposed to the shame of being told you're not worthy, you don't deserve, you are dirty. Just breathe. We need to close out before break. Sorry, I saw you wanted to come in. Would you just use this last moment, whatever you wanted to say, we have just like 1 minute, and then also let people know how they can find you or find out more resources and work that you have. And
yeah, you can find me on my website, robindiangelo.com, and a lot of my articles are there. One that I'm particularly proud of, and I think was the most downloaded ever for this journal, was My Class Didn't Trump My Race, using oppression to face privilege. And I tell my class story in that piece, and then why I center racism in my work and not classism.
that might be where we pick up later in the next part. We're Dr. Becky Martinez, Kathy Obear with Dr. Robin DiAngelo, looking at Classism, Center for Transformation Change Radio. We'll be back after a quick break.
Welcome back. We're glad you are here to continue to be in this conversation with Dr. Robin DiAngelo. And we actually are going to go back because prior to our break, it was like, oh, I want to say something, but I forgot what that was. And during break, remembered it. So let's start from that point.
Yeah, thank you. You had asked, how I see class manifesting, and I mentioned minimization and such. But another way is a kind of confidence that I'm in awe of, and that comes across a kind of the effect of being told across your life that you could do or be anything you wanted. Now, I know that no matter if we're talking girls, that's not the only message we get. There's another message of patriarchy and sexism that kind of interferes with that message. But still, to be getting that is powerful, and so I notice it. It's I imagine what whiteness in the bones might look like to a person of color. Like there's a way in which you walk into the room with an expectation that you belong, and that you do and will identify with who is there, and that you will not be different, right? And so on. And so I read it in the bodies and the way that upper class people move through the world, and then I feel resentful. I mean, that's the truth. There's a kind of resentment, a kind of awe, and I'm sure a kind of insecurity that it invokes. And because none of that, or it's seldom right up front, then it's a dynamic that's happening that's shaping what happens in that room, just like race shapes it and so forth, but not necessarily acknowledged.
Yeah. Well, what comes up for me, Robin, and I don't know if it's like class, there could be some age stuff there, some race stuff, because sometimes when I see folks show up like that in my internal space, I just call bullshit. I'm like, you're not showing up authentic. Like, you're just giving me a story. Like where's your integrity? Like, who are you? And that is my story. So I don't know that or not, but sometimes in my head, I call bullshit when folks can show up that way. And so again, I think that there's some intersections around that, and even maybe the family, like culture intersection. But oftentimes it's like, oh, is this real? I don't know if this is real.
Yeah, I am surprised and disappointed by how often I am tricked by it. How often, unfortunately, that there's an expression that is used in AA, which is comparing your insides with their outsides. So I see this outside veneer, and then, I think I can see all my insecurities, and it amplifies it. I wish I could just go, that's bullshit. I think here we got another intersection. I was also raised Catholic. Okay. Catholic, female, poor.
Me too.
Who do you think you are? Those kinds of messages. Yeah.
Yeah. And I relate to the imposter syndrome. So I don't know if all people who grew up as I did, or even with more class privilege, as female particularly, know we have to show this confident if we want to work our way up, if we want to get the recognition that we know we should have. But I do believe underneath there is some, as you said, it's bullshit. But then there's that, as we talked with Jamie Washington, this arrogance and entitlement that I think also comes with class privilege of I deserve.
Right.
And I know out of that, I've treated folks with less class privilege, often also folk of color, with more dismissive and you need to serve me. And even if I'm smiling, and I see white folks do this all the time. And so I don't know if that'll take us anywhere, but I just wanted to join you in my class privilege.
Yeah. Well, I had a thought, which is just a few examples of what it looks like class arrogance or class privilege. One is before I ever went to college, I was waiting tables, right? So I didn't really know where I could go in life. And I was seeing this therapist at a Unitarian church. And somehow in the conversation, I said, well, I want to do what you do, right? I'd love to be like a therapist. And she just kind of laughed and said, well, you need an advanced degree to be a therapist. Just really really contemptuous and minimizing, and that's never going to happen for you. I'll never forget that moment. And, and it just pushes you down. It takes a really long time to kind of realize, no, I am going to be able to do that. And of course, I will lay in bed and remember that
Mm.
fucking therapist
Mm.
and want to run into her and shove my PhD in her face.
Oh, yeah.
So that was one moment. Another more subtle one is when I did go to college and had no idea if I was smart. Very first class, English Lit 101. And the first assignment was write about a place that has meaning for you. So I wrote the story about actually the little town my grandma lived in that we were living in when my mother died. And, you know, I remember like, oh, God, I hope I haven't made a fool of myself. So I hand this paper in, and when she hands it back to me, she says, you should have this published. And I actually was like this moment of like, did you get the right name? You couldn't actually be talking about my paper, but that's all she said. And I had no idea. Of course, I never got it published because see, I look back and I think she must have assumed I'd know how to do that.
Right.
What if she had said, I can help you do that, or would you know where to get started? So that was a lost opportunity in place where, and then there was a white women's group that started in my city, and they would meet for over a meal in one woman's home to talk about racism. And I went to two, and first of all, the moment you drive up to houses like that, the most beautiful house in the beautiful neighborhood, and you just like, oh, what would it be like to have a house like this? So it's already starting, right? As you walk up the door into the door, and then the house is gorgeous. And then the spread of food is mind-blowing. And then the art on the wall from their travels. And now we're all sitting at this table talking about whiteness and racism. And I just couldn't do it. On both those levels, it just seemed really not. And it's not like it's not like I have an answer, or I would have wanted to shame them or something, but it was something so not working for me with all that.
Well, and oftentimes those places don't work for me either. So I can relate into that. And sometimes it's not that I feel uncomfortable. It's just like, this is not my space.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I'm thinking I should have, you know what? I should have suggested, you know what? I know you're not aware of it, but the environment is hard for some of us.
Yeah. Let's
meet at the community center, in a library, in a room that isn't attached to all of this, because, you know, one, we're working on privilege, but the class privilege is kind of drowning out some of that. And it just feels inappropriate.
Yeah, and even your descriptors of the house, how classed that can be, right? Beautiful house, gorgeous inside. And so how we use language, right, to create the picture. And then that can elicit so much like internalized stuff for folks.
Yeah. And the way that people with a lot of access to resources talk about their travels with an assumption that everybody has had access to travel, that's another area where it's not like you can't share those things, but it's that kind of not remotely imagining that this is something not accessible to everybody, and you're talking to people with the assumption that they share this, and they just don't. And the impact is to silence you, as you just go small. I mean, I'm just telling you, that's what happens for me. I just go small, and I'm not really present in the same way.
It reminds me of folks with class privilege be included. I think there's a pitying in that moment, be like, oh, I'm sorry you can't travel. And you can probably feel that energy, and assuming that then you feel shame. And there might have been other places you wanted to go. I just wondered if we wanted to circle back a bit to shame too.
Yeah. You had said earlier before the break, Kathy, that you feel class shame, and I've heard that before. I know you're not owning class, but I do have a friend who works with owning class white women to help them redistribute their wealth around racial justice. And that theme that they feel shame, comes up a lot. And when they're asked to tell their class story, they don't want to tell it in front of other people. And while I'll be honest, I feel somewhat frustrated with it. It just doesn't seem the same.
No.
And it seems like a not necessarily conscious, but a move to slip into victimization so that you're more even, but even in a way that may not be authentic, right? And so I'm just curious about how that functions. And it's not to say that you don't feel shame,
Right.
but the weight of that, it just seems so different for somebody who actually had class oppression. You know what I mean? So I'll just put that out there and see what your thoughts are about what happens in the room when somebody with privilege moves into the shame narrative. So I always find that fascinating. What does it do to the conversation? And is it, well, I always think it's worth looking at.
I love it. You always make me think differently. And when you're talking, I'm like, where do I share or where do we share in a class? So if we're in a class accountability group with other folks who have class privilege and we're sharing, that's where that needs to be shared, in my opinion, and to explore when we might use it. I think I've used it to say, I'm close enough to you, so don't confront me on classist attitudes or behaviors. So the evening is more to avoid being asked to look at my privilege and own the classist impact I've had and have to make amends for it and change my behavior. And I know even talking to you, Becky, I've held back, like saying how much money I've made over the years.
I know.
I've shared some, and I think once I may have. Some of that is shame, and some of it is I don't want to have to look in the mirror on how I use my resources once they come into my life. And that struggle of, well, have I redistributed enough so that I can not feel shame? And so send some money to Georgia to Senator Warnock. Okay, I feel like I can then hold on to my other money and use it in my own. So I wonder how much of it is a move to teapot, when it like goes, woo. So enough to let the steam out, but then I can then stay with all my class privilege and just do enough, but not have to share 90% of my wealth as I see some owning class people do, because I am not there yet.
Yeah, so I do discourse analysis, and so that is like kind of really like the thinking critically about narratives. This is why, I always say the question that's never failed me in this work is not, is this true or false, good or bad, right or wrong, but how does it function? Does it function to open or close, right? And a narrative that's very common, and this is important to me in this conversation because I want to help listeners see, what does it look like, right? What is class entitlement that you take for granted look like? And one is to use narratives such as lucky and fortunate and
so good.
blessed.
Good.
So, which is completely right. Like, no, it's a system, and it's not a matter of just luck and blessings. And when we move into blessings, now we're in to that idea of manifest destiny. These are really deep white supremacy narratives, right?
Yep. Christian religion,
God
blessed you.
Smiles on, yeah, right. Westward expansion in that whole narrative.
Yeah. And that's so I appreciate you bringing that up around, like, I know that I catch myself in before it comes out, like lucky or blessed. Sometimes I think about how, like, why me? Right. And so why me? And I think it is a class, race, gender intersection. And then I can get really just in these deep emotional spaces, right? When I hear my family, my parents particularly, who still struggle, right? And I drive a fancy car, right? I drive an Audi. And my dad particularly says, you worked hard for that. And I did. Like, I worked my ass off for that. And it's a marker, and I don't know if I'd buy one again. And then there's the flip side, like, and you and mom work so much harder than I do, right? At 71, right? And so there's this like tension and dissonance. So when I think shame and guilt, right? Like that's where the cycle for me is around class. It's like, oh, yes, I worked hard in this hardworking narrative. And then how do I not compare? Right. And so how, like sometimes with, folks of working class origin, like how do we not compare our ache or our work to different types of labor and still be really proud of where we're at, while also showing, like, holding great humility in that space.
Yeah, I love you said that ache. It is like an ache, isn't it? When you
Mhm.
see it and you just ache for it and then, marvel over it and what would it be like to have had it? And yeah, that just captures, I feel like, a lot of my life, particularly early on. And so I just want to say, look, shame is a feeling and it's a very unpleasant feeling. But if we're back to how does it function in the conversation, right? The point isn't that you deny it, but that you do think about when and where you're bringing it up, or how it functions, not just in the conversation, but within you, right? And one way that it can function is to actually render you good again, if this makes sense. So shame, unlike guilt is I did something bad, and shame is I am bad. But if I feel shame, then I'm actually good because I know that that's bad, therefore I'm good. You have to sit with it, but
Yeah, that's a lot of heady stuff that I got to figure out.
all right. Well, I have actually a whole chapter on it in Nice Racism, where I unpack it much more articulately. But I also, there's another narrative that really gets to me, which is, well, we were poor, but we didn't know it because we had so much love.
Yeah.
And when I hear that, I think to myself, one, then you weren't poor. I do. That's what I think, because I'm sorry, but poverty is not some kind of romantic form of simple living. It's brutal. It's painful. It hurts. I just don't, it's not ameliorated by love. Do you know what I mean? That I'm just telling you, that's how that lands on me. That it just didn't, I didn't even notice we were poor because we had so much love.
I wonder if they're both true. Go, Becky.
Yeah, so I appreciate the love space, because I do hear, and even in my own experience, like, because Lou, in his social class worldview model, talks about referent groups, right? And so you didn't know that you were poor until you met people who weren't. Right. It's like, for rich folks, I just thought kind of everybody lived like that. And then I went to college and that shifted, right? Or I got a job and that shifted, or I did volunteer work and that shifted. And so Dr. Carmen Rivera in our Straddling Class book talks about not love. She says, we didn't have a lot, right? So, but like we had these family values, we had this caring community, we had this, like money didn't mean much, right? And so I do wonder if there's a race intersection on that space, rather than it being individual. But like I hear you and I'm like, oh yeah. And then I hear Carmen and I say, oh yeah. And I'm like, how do we hold both of those as possibilities and it not having to be one or the other?
Yeah, actually, so this is where my question, how does it function, really works for me, because I'm thinking in that case, I see it functioning as a contradiction to the prejudice around poor people, or you're lazy, you're dirty, you don't care, you have bad values, you don't have good ethics. And so she's making a point. No, we had a beautiful culture. To me, it was not those things, and I think both can be true. And there was brutal pain and all kinds of things that poverty brings, right? So it's just interrupting the ideas that you couldn't be poor and have those values.
Right. Yeah.
And there may be another context in which she would talk differently about it, based on what's happening.
And I could be wrong, but both of those seem to keep it at the individual family level. That if you have love, at least it's not so bad, as opposed to the system that needs people in poverty and working class for the very few at the top and in the middle. And so how do we change all those narratives? We only have a few minutes left, and I saw you maybe moving to close us out, Dr. Martinez.
Oh, I didn't.
Oh, well then.
There. I think I was just so into this conversation. So as we only have a few minutes, Robin, any last nugget that you would like to share with us as we end?
Well, I was also thinking, like, Kathy, I appreciate your point, right? What does it do when we just go to the individual narrative? But I hear what you shared, Becky, as she's talking about the community, right? So she's trying to push back against that structural positioning poor people as at fault for their position, right? Well, just something kind of fun. And I don't know that I want to, I should share this in the sense of don't start looking for it, but people who grew up poor will always be at the front of the buffet line. If you ever go to a buffet with me, Kathy, or Becky, you know, we're at a conference or something, you pay attention. I will manage to get at the beginning of that motherfucker because I'm going to get that food before it runs out.
Yeah, and you want to make sure it's the good stuff.
And it's fun. I sit there and I'm smiling to myself because I know I'm going to do it. And then I know that a few other people I know that share my class background are probably going to be right there next to me. It's just kind of a fun little thing that we do.
Yeah, and that is such a good, I love that observation and sharing because I asked often like, what felt like a treat for you or it was fancy when you growing up? And so many people will say, the Sizzler, a buffet, right? Yeah. McDonald's, because of the amount of food that you can get.
Yeah. I also want to own my own classism at this point, because I remember teaching a class in Westfield, which is kind of a working class town, a state school. It was near Smith and Mount Holyoke and Amherst, but not any of those things. And a student came in and shared that she was going out for her anniversary dinner with her boyfriend. And I asked where they were going. And she said, Chili's. And inside my head, I just rolled my eyes and I shared that when I got home. You know, I mocked her. You know, I'm just going to own it. So, you know, it's not that we can't also participate when we get into a different position. So.
The complexity of a class straddler.
Yes.
Robin, your vulnerability, honesty, the way you think, I've learned with you one more time. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
As we close, y'all can find Dr. Robin DiAngelo on her website. And Becky and I are so grateful to you. Next time, we have the Reverend Dr. Jamie Washington, which will finish out our year of understanding class and classism, and we won't be done, and we'll be putting a comma in it. Final thought, Becky?
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thanks, listeners, for creating action. Keep on doing it.
Love you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Dr. Kathy Obear on Transformation Talk Radio. Thanks for tuning in, and be sure to catch us next time as Kathy inspires listeners to become agents of change, motivate, innovate, and speak truth to power. Step into the courageous you that will change the world. Connect to life-changing conversations to extend your reach. For more information on Kathy and her work, please visit drkathyobear.com. That's drkathyobear.com.